The email arrived at 6:52 on a Tuesday evening, less than 2 hours before the one reserved swim window my son had left in his entire week, informing me that the community pool was closing immediately due to critical chlorine imbalance, posing an immediate health hazard. And I remember standing in my kitchen reading it while my son Elian, 10 years old, already had his swim shirt half on, already asking in the careful, repetitive way he asks things when he's anxious about a change in routine, whether we were still going, whether we were still going, whether we were still going. I told him yes, because at that point I still believed the email, and it took me exactly one phone call and 11 minutes to understand that I had just told my son a lie I didn't know was a lie yet, because the pool was not actually closing for any chemical hazard at all. My name is Farouk Delacroix-Rosai. Elian is my son, and he has been diagnosed with autism since he was 4, along with a co-occurring sensory processing profile that makes water, specifically, one of the very few environments where his entire nervous system reliably settles into something close to calm. His occupational therapist, a patient, precise woman named Conception Ferraraboyd, explained this to us years ago in terms I still think about constantly, that for Elian, submersion and controlled water resistance provide a kind of full-body proprioceptive input that almost nothing else in his life replicates, and that consistent, predictable swim time was, in her clinical language, a core regulatory intervention rather than a recreational nicety. We live in Ashgrove Meadows, a community of about 270 homes, and for 3 years, Elian's swim time had followed the exact same structure every single Tuesday and Thursday evening, a reserved hour at the community pool during the designated, quiet hours window our previous HOA board had specifically created, at my request, to accommodate residents needing lower sensory, lower crowd swim access, an accommodation that, notably, had been formally documented and approved years earlier as a disability-related modification under our HOA's own accessibility policy. That accommodation had worked without incident for 3 years, right up until a woman named Priscilla Wentworth Hale was elected board president about 5 months before this story starts, replacing a board that had, by every account I ever heard, taken accessibility accommodations seriously and without complaint. Priscilla's tenure began the way I've since learned so many of these situations begin, with a wave of aggressive relitigation of previously settled community policies, and within her first 2 months, my quiet hours swim accommodation had become, for reasons I did not initially understand, a specific and recurring target of her attention. I want to walk you through exactly how this escalated, because the pattern matters enormously for understanding what came later. Priscilla's first move was a letter informing me that the quiet hours accommodation would need to undergo a policy review to ensure it remained consistent with fair and equitable amenity access for all residents, language that struck me, even then, as an unusually elaborate way of questioning whether my disabled son deserved 2 specific hours a week out of the pool's roughly 70 weekly open hours. I responded with documentation, Elian's diagnosis, Conception's clinical letter explaining the regulatory function of his swim time, and the original approval documentation from years earlier establishing this as a formal accommodation under our HOA's own accessibility policy, not a discretionary courtesy that could simply be revoked on review. Priscilla's response was non-committal, stating the review remained ongoing, and for about 6 weeks, nothing further happened, and I genuinely believed, based on the strength of that documentation, that this had quietly resolved itself. Then came the closures. The first one happened on a Thursday, an email arriving about an hour before Elian's swim window, citing a routine maintenance issue requiring immediate pool closure. I didn't think much of it at the time. Pools do occasionally need emergency maintenance, and I explained to Elian, who took the disruption to his routine considerably harder than I expected, that this was just an unusual, one-time thing. It was not one time. Over the following 6 weeks, this same pattern repeated itself 5 more times, always on a Tuesday or Thursday, always with a closure notice arriving within an hour or 2 of Elian's specific swim window, always citing either routine maintenance or increasingly specific chemical imbalance concerns, elevated chlorine, elevated pH, bacterial contamination risk, each notice using slightly different technical language that, to an ordinary reader, sounded like legitimate. Unavoidable pool safety concerns. I want to tell you about the toll this took on Elian, because I think it's the part of this story that made me move from confused frustration to something considerably more determined. Each cancelled swim session meant a meltdown that, per Conception's careful clinical notes tracking his regulation over that period, took progressively longer to recover from as the pattern repeated, his baseline anxiety climbing steadily as the predictability that made the accommodation work in the first place eroded week by week. By the sixth closure, Elian had started asking, before I'd even opened the email, whether the pool was going to be closed again, a question delivered with a kind of resigned, anticipatory dread that broke my heart every single time I heard it. I called the HOA management office after that sixth closure, no longer willing to accept these as isolated coincidences, and asked directly for the actual chemical testing records that had prompted each closure, since our community pool, like most, was required under County Health Code to maintain a testing log documenting chlorine and pH levels on a regular schedule. Records that, as a resident, I understood I had a legal right to request and review. What I received, about a week later, after what felt like a suspiciously long delay for a simple records request, was a stack of testing logs that on their face appeared to document exactly the chemical imbalances Priscilla's closure notices had described. Elevated chlorine on the dates matching the first two closures, elevated pH on the third, bacterial contamination flagged on the fourth and fifth. Everything appeared, at a casual glance, to be exactly what it claimed to be. I want to introduce you to my neighbor, Rosalind Enkemelu-Fairweather, who happens to hold a graduate degree in environmental chemistry and works as a laboratory quality control supervisor for a regional water testing firm, a professional background that, once I mentioned my frustration to her over coffee one afternoon, turned out to be extraordinarily relevant to exactly the problem I was facing. Rosalind offered to review the testing logs herself, and what she found, after about 20 minutes of careful reading, changed the entire direction of this investigation. "Farrokh," she said, "these logs are internally inconsistent in a way that suggests something's wrong. Look at this entry from the third closure, the one citing elevated pH. The reading listed here is 8.4, well outside normal range, sure. But the very next scheduled reading, less than 24 hours later, shows a completely normal 7.4, with no documented remediation action logged in between, no chemical adjustment, no shock treatment, nothing. A pH swing that dramatic doesn't correct itself overnight without active intervention. Either someone failed to document the remediation, which would itself be a compliance violation, or this reading was never actually accurate in the first place." Rosalind found similar inconsistencies across 3 of the 6 closure logs, readings that either failed to show any documented corrective action before supposedly returning to normal, or in one case, a bacterial contamination flag that, per the actual County Health Code testing protocol Rosalind was intimately familiar with through her professional work, would have required a minimum 48-hour pool closure for proper remediation and retesting. Not the single evening closure that had actually occurred before the pool reopened the very next morning. "This is a pattern," Rosalind told me, spreading the 6 logs across my kitchen table. "Someone is either falsifying these numbers entirely or manipulating a single test reading without ever actually treating the water, closing the pool just long enough to disrupt your son's specific swim window, and then reopening it the next day once the disruption has already happened. I think before you do anything else, you need independent verification, because if these logs are fabricated, that's not just a disability accommodation dispute anymore. That's a health code violation and potentially outright fraud, given how it's specifically timed. I want to walk you through the decision that followed, because it's the moment that turned this from a private frustration into something with real institutional weight behind it." Rosalind helped me identify our state's environmental health laboratory, the same accredited facility that county health departments themselves use for official water quality disputes, and explained that as a resident, I had standing to request an independent state inspection of our community pool's actual water chemistry, particularly given documented inconsistencies in the association's own self-reported testing logs. I filed that request the same week, along with a formal complaint to our county health department flagging the specific documentary inconsistencies Rosalind had identified. And I want to tell you, the timeline that followed moved considerably faster than I expected, largely, I would later learn. Because health departments take falsified pool safety documentation extremely seriously given the genuine public health risk involved, if a pool's actual chemical balance were ever allowed to drift as far out of range as it could if closures were being faked to disguise the absence of any real testing or maintenance happening at all. What the state lab found, once they conducted an unannounced independent inspection about 10 days later, went considerably beyond even what Rosalind and I had suspected, revealing not just a pattern of closures timed to disrupt Elian's accommodation, but something about the actual ongoing chemical maintenance of that pool that put every single family using it, not just my son, at a level of risk that none of us had any idea we'd been living with. The document Farah's discovery process eventually surfaced was a message thread from a private group chat Dolores maintained with 2 other residents, obtained through a subpoena Farah filed once the formal civil suit was underway. And I want to tell you, reading it for the first time in Farah's office was one of the more disturbing experiences of this entire ordeal, because it removed any remaining possibility that what happened at Zymna's party could be explained away as an isolated, poorly judged moment of panic. In that thread, dated nearly 4 months before the quinceañera, Dolores had written, discussing an entirely different family's gathering at the community's shared amenity pool, that she felt Sable Creek Landing was starting to attract the wrong kind of visitors, and that she intended to keep a closer eye on who's coming and going, especially at the larger parties, language that, combined with everything that followed, read less like a general concern about noise or crowding and considerably more like an explicit statement of intent to specifically monitor and target gatherings based on exactly the kind of demographic profile she'd acted on at my own home. The same thread included references to at least 3 other specific incidents: the Oil Arenape's christening citation, the Escobar's birthday noise complaint, and a 3rd incident involving a family I hadn't previously known about, the Delacroix-Renwosis, who had apparently received an unusually aggressive parking citation during a graduation party months earlier. In each case, the thread showed Dolores discussing these families using language that made clear her enforcement decisions were being driven by exactly the kind of targeted, discriminatory motivation Farah had suspected from the very beginning. This changes the entire scope of the case, Farah told me once we'd finished reading through the full thread together. This isn't one bad decision made in a moment of poor judgment anymore. This is a documented pattern of intentional, targeted discrimination against Latino, Black, and immigrant families in this community, using HOA enforcement authority as the mechanism and culminating in an actual false report to a federal immigration enforcement agency, based on nothing more than the language and appearance of the people at a private family gathering. This is exactly the kind of case that fair housing and civil rights statutes were written to address. Farah filed a comprehensive civil suit on our family's behalf, incorporating both the specific incident at Zymna's party and, through formal outreach to the other affected families, additional claims brought jointly by the Oil Arenapes, the Escobar's family, and the Delacroix-Renwosis, each represented by Farah as part of what became, over the following months, a coordinated civil rights action alleging a pattern of discriminatory enforcement in violation of both federal fair housing protections and our state's specific civil rights statutes addressing harassment based on national origin and ethnicity. I want to walk you through the legal theory underlying this case because I think it's genuinely important for anyone else who might find themselves facing something similar. Fair housing law doesn't just prohibit outright refusal to sell or rent housing based on protected characteristics. It also prohibits a pattern of harassment or discriminatory enforcement of community rules that has the effect of making housing conditions hostile or unequal based on someone's race, ethnicity, or national origin. And Farah's argument, supported directly by Dolores's own documented messages, was that her selective, aggressive citation pattern against specifically Latino and Black families, culminating in an actual false report to immigration enforcement with no underlying factual basis whatsoever, represented exactly this kind of unlawful, targeted harassment. The false report to immigration enforcement itself added a separate, serious legal dimension to the case. Farah explained that several states, including our own, had specific statutes addressing the filing of false reports to law enforcement or federal agencies made with discriminatory intent, sometimes colloquially referred to in media coverage of similar cases around the country as anti-harassment or false emergency reporting statutes, specifically designed to address situations where someone weaponizes a call to authorities against another person based on nothing more than racial or ethnic bias. A phenomenon that had, in recent years, become depressingly well documented enough that several jurisdictions had passed targeted legislation addressing exactly this kind of conduct. I want to tell you about the emotional weight of the discovery process, because it was, honestly, one of the more difficult periods of the entire case, sitting through depositions where Dolores, under oath, was forced to explain, line by line, the messages in that group chat, unable to offer any coherent explanation for language that so clearly and explicitly described exactly the kind of discriminatory targeting Farah had alleged. I remember Farah later telling me that Dolores's deposition testimony, attempting at various points to characterize her own written words as taken out of context or just venting frustration, did very little to persuade anyone reviewing the actual transcript, given how specific and repeated the pattern of targeting had been across multiple documented incidents over several months. The HOA board itself, once formally notified of the lawsuit and provided with the group chat evidence through the discovery process, moved considerably faster than I expected to distance itself from Dolores entirely, calling an emergency session within 2 weeks of receiving formal notice of the litigation and voting unanimously to remove her from the board immediately and to issue a formal community-wide statement condemning her conduct and committing to a full independent review of the association's enforcement practices going forward. A review that, once completed, resulted in the adoption of a formal anti-discrimination policy explicitly prohibiting the kind of targeted, demographically motivated enforcement Dolores had engaged in. I want to tell you how the lawsuit itself resolved, because it took just over a year from filing to final settlement, considerably longer than some of the other HOA disputes I've heard about from friends over the years, largely because the joint nature of the case, representing 4 separate families with overlapping but individually distinct claims, added real complexity to the negotiation process. Facing overwhelming documentary evidence, my own recording of the actual immigration enforcement call, and testimony from 3 other families describing a clear, consistent pattern of targeted harassment, Dolores and her insurance carrier ultimately agreed to a substantial settlement covering all 4 families, including significant compensation for emotional distress, given the specific trauma associated with the false immigration report, along with a formal written acknowledgement of discriminatory conduct entered into the public record. I want to tell you about the day Farah called to tell me the settlement had been finalized, because I remember sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd first played back that recording of Dolores's voice describing my family as people who appear to be here illegally, and feeling something in my chest finally loosen after nearly 14 months of carrying this. Zaimna, who was 15 by the time the case resolved, and had grown up considerably in her understanding of exactly what had happened during those tense hours of her own quinceañera weekend, asked me that evening what the settlement actually meant, and I remember trying to explain it to her in terms that captured both the legal outcome and something I felt mattered even more, that the recording she'd watched me quietly make on that terrifying afternoon. Standing frozen by our back door, with a tray of empanadas going cold in my hands, had ended up being the single most important thing that protected not just our family, but three other families who had been carrying their own version of this same fear and humiliation, often silently, for months before any of us realized how connected our individual experiences actually were. If there's a lesson in this story, and I've thought about this often in the time since, it's something Farah said to me during one of our very first meetings, long before we understood the full scope of what Dolores had been doing. She said that discriminatory harassment, particularly the kind that hides behind the language of community standards and neighborhood safety, survives specifically because the people targeted by it often assume, understandably, that nobody will believe them, that a single incident will be dismissed as an overreaction, or that speaking up will simply invite more scrutiny rather than less. What breaks that pattern, she said, is exactly what happened here: individual families finding each other, comparing notes, and realizing that what felt like an isolated, personal humiliation was in fact part of something considerably larger and more deliberate than any one family could have proven or even fully recognized alone. We found each other, and it turns out that one recorded phone call, three other families willing to come forward with their own experiences, and a group chat that Dolores Whitfield Ashby never imagined would end up subpoenaed and read aloud in a deposition, were more than enough to prove that the wrong kind of visitors she'd been so determined to keep out of Sable Creek Landing had never been anything more than families who looked and sounded different from her own. Thumbnail text: She called ICE on MY family's party.